On the 6th of February 1991, Dutch author Richard Klinkhamer reported his wife Hanny's disappearance to the police. According to him, Hanny stormed out of the house after a heated argument and hadn't been back home for the past 5 days. None of her friends or colleagues at work had heard from her either. The only clue he found was her red bicycle parked in the train station. During the investigation, all accounts pointed to Richard having a hand in her disappearance, but there was no evidence to pin him down. The case was eventually closed with Hanny declared missing. 9 years later, a family who bought the couple's former house discovered skeletal remains buried under the shed. Childhood. Richard Klinkhamer was born on the 15th of March 1937 in the small town of Ermelo in the Netherlands. He was born just before the Second World War and had a rough childhood growing up. Richard was barely 3 when his parents got divorced, leaving him in the custody of his mother. At a very young age, he experienced the instability of constantly moving and changing homes due to his mother's unstable relationships. He saw firsthand the brutal treatment his uncle suffered in the hands of soldiers, and even witnessed the gruesome murder of their neighbors by those soldiers. At some point, his mother had several relationships with Nazi soldiers, prostituting herself just to make ends meet. But this only caused her and women like her to be stripped and paraded around town in what was called the Ugly Carnival. Seeing his mother stripped and shamed traumatized 8-year-old Richard, who already had so much emotional baggage. Eventually, at the age of 11, Richard moves in with his dad, only to discover that the man he knew as his father wasn't actually his biological father. Thankfully, he doesn't treat Richard any differently and continues to raise him as his own. Being reunited with his half-brothers and the man he knew to be his father brought the stability and comfort Richard lacked growing up. While he was there, he becomes a butcher's apprentice but is wrongly accused of stealing from his boss, so he quits. At the age of 18, Richard enlists himself into the French Foreign Legion, where he serves for 4 years before trying to escape. He is caught on his first escape mission and punished, but 3 months later, he tries again, and this time successfully escapes back to Amsterdam, where he reunites with his father and half-brothers. He starts documenting his past experiences and soon after meets his wife. Interestingly, Hanny wasn't Richard's first wife. His first wife, Leontine, was the only child of a middle-class family. Being the only child, her parents adopted another girl who was a few years younger than her as a sister. And this was who she grew up with. Richard married 22-year-old Leontine at the age of 25. The couple start a business and have 2 sons shortly after. Everything seems to be going well until Richard starts to drift away from Leontine. He finally confesses to her that he has fallen in love with Hanny, her foster sister. Yes, the adopted sister Leontine grew up with was whom Richard had fallen in love with. Leontine was, of course, heartbroken, but she tried to save her marriage. She was accommodating of the relationship, and the 3 lived together, with Richard alternating sleeping quarters between both women. But this arrangement only lasted for about 3 months before hell let loose. The women were constantly at each other's throats, with Hanny mostly taunting Leontine and her kids. Hanny eventually left the house, and a few weeks later, Richard and Leontine officially got divorced. Despite Richard being 10 years older than Hanny, the 2 get married in 1978 and relocate to Ganzedijk in northeastern Netherlands, and there they start a new life. Writing career. Life in their new home was all they had ever dreamed of. Hanny worked as a pediatric nurse in the town hospital. Richard was also making money from his writing career. He gained substantial fame from his first book, Obedient Like a Dog, which was based on his experience in the French army. He also published a collection of short stories, which he titled Hotel Red. They both had a stable income, a good social life, and were saving enough to retire in the next 20 years. However, things took a turn for the worse when the stock market crashed in 1987. Now, this ordinarily wouldn't be a problem for the couple, but Richard had been diverting half of their savings into the stock market without Hanny's knowledge. And when the stock market crashed, he started gambling the other half, hoping to win back their savings, but he lost them all. Hanny was furious and felt betrayed by her husband, but rather than feel remorseful, Richard started drinking heavily to drown his worries. He was constantly taking his frustrations out on Hanny, yelling and blaming her for his losses and even beating her after his heavy drinking sprees. Hanny, on the other hand, started spending more time in the hospital and with her friends. The couple was drifting apart, and the few times they were around each other were mostly spent arguing. After such arguments, Hanny would leave the house and spend some time alone in the park or at her friend's house. They lived in a small, quiet neighborhood, and their neighbors would often hear them arguing. One night, on January 31st, the arguments started again, and after a while, it stopped. Hanny's disappearance. 5 days later, Richard reported Hanny's disappearance to the police. According to him, Hanny stormed out of the house on the 31st of January and hadn't come back home. He had seen her bicycle at the train station and assumed that she was at work. It wasn't unusual for her to spend more time at the hospital or with her friends after their arguments, so he hadn't put much thought into it. But when he realized that no one had seen or heard from her for the last 5 days, he decided to report to the police. Many of Hanny's friends didn't believe Richard's account of their friend's disappearance. They knew about Richard's violent outbursts and were convinced that he was responsible for her disappearance. The couple's neighbors also gave their account during the investigations. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, their neighbors would often hear them arguing and, after a while, hear or see someone, usually Hanny, storm out the door. The night Richard reported her disappearance, they had heard them again, but a few moments later, their home went silent. They never heard the door open and close. No one stormed out of the door. All accounts from friends and neighbors pointed to Richard as the main suspect, so he was invited for questioning. The couple's home was also thoroughly searched using sniffer dogs and aerial scanning, but they found nothing to detain Richard with. The only discoveries they made in the couple's home were Richard's meat grinder, a hatchet, and some hooks. But nothing was solid enough to detain Richard, so he was released. A few months later, Hanny was declared missing and presumed dead, and that was it. The end. Richard went back to living alone in their home. He continued writing and never stopped his heavy drinking habit. 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Richard presented the manuscript of his third book to his publisher. The book, titled Woensdag Gehaktdag, which translates to Wednesday Mince Meat, was about a man who finds out that his wife has been cheating. The protagonist kills his wife and then goes on to detail 7 gruesome ways he would have killed her, including pushing her body through a meat grinder and then feeding it to pigeons. Remember, this is a manuscript that he has just submitted to his publisher. Richard's publisher, William Donker, finds the story too gory and refuses to publish it. He further asks Richard what inspired him to write it, and Richard says that he only wanted to give the people something to talk about since they wouldn't stop spreading rumors about his role in his wife's disappearance. Donker presses further and asks Richard if the rumors about him murdering his wife were true. To this question, Richard says, "It's not yet time to talk about it." His publisher refuses to go ahead with the book, however. He advises Richard to expand on a section of the manuscript that wasn't as horrific. Details of Richard's disturbing manuscript somehow gets to the public, further fueling the rumor that he had indeed killed his wife. The rumors become even stronger, earning him front-page appearances in the local press. Richard himself seemed to be fueling the rumors. When asked during an interview session if he had indeed killed his wife, Richard replied, "It could be. The people say I cut her into pieces." Rather than clear his name like an innocent person would, he was making jokes like, "Everyone is able to murder someone suddenly, and I bet a body could fit into that hole." Fast forward to 1997, that's 6 years after his wife's disappearance. Richard decides to sell the house and move back to Amsterdam. But there's one problem. The house was in Hanny's name and he couldn't sell it without her consent. So in order to do that, he hired a lawyer to have her legally pronounced dead, thus transferring full ownership to him as her next of kin. After this was done, he sold the house, applied for a widower's pension, and then moved back to Amsterdam with his 25-year-old girlfriend. At this point, Richard had built his reputation as a cult figure amongst crime writers. People were fascinated by his works and how his mind could conceive such graphic horror stories. Some people thought he was an opportunist trying to take advantage of his wife's mysterious disappearance to sell his book. But for many, he was a murderous psychopath who seemed to love the attention he was getting. Discovery. Meanwhile, back in Ganzedijk, the house was resold to another couple who decided to make a few changes to their home. Amongst other things, they wanted to get rid of the old shed in the garden, so they hired diggers to work on that. And this is where they make a chilling discovery. The men, while digging, unexpectedly dig into a skull, a human skull. And it wasn't just that. They also discovered the skeletal remains of a human body buried under the shed. The police were immediately informed, and the remains were confirmed to be Hanny's through her dental records. Word spreads quickly amongst Hanny's friends and former neighbors, and that same day, Richard was arrested in Amsterdam. There he confessed to the murder, detailing what really happened on that night. Apparently he and Hanny had gotten into another heated argument, and Richard, who was heavily drunk at the time, had struck her with a bat repeatedly. He then buried her in the shed and spread compost around the area to mask the smell. That's why he didn't file a missing report until 5 days later, and why the sniffer dogs were unable to detect anything. Following his confession, Richard was sentenced to 7 years in prison for murder, but he never served his full term. In 2003, he was released for good conduct after only serving 2 years in prison. Richard went back to his home in Amsterdam, but perhaps he never found peace. He eventually took his own life at the age of 78.